So here's how Over Your Head was made. Here's how Sanguine Paradise was made. So here's how Venetia was made. So here's how Futsal Shuffle was made. This is a really cool effect that you hear in a lot of the leads of these beats. Now this is the most important thing that I'm going to tell you in this tutorial. Alright, what's good YouTube? So in this tutorial, I'm going to be going over how to make hyperpop beats for Lil Uzi, and the style of producers like working on Dying Members, specifically Brandon Finessin. In this tutorial, I'm going to be going over the best VSTs and presets to use, how to make proper drum patterns for these types of beats, the best drum sounds and kits to use, how to construct a proper melody, various deconstructions of Lil Uzi beats, as well as various tips and tricks along the way. Also, if you want any of the drum sounds or samples that I use in this tutorial, there's a link in the description where you can download them completely free. So between his two most recent albums, Pluto, Baby Pluto, and Atake, there's really two styles of beats that you hear in like 90% of his songs, and they don't have names. For the sake of this tutorial though, I'm going to call them spins and Zay beats. But with that in mind, let's talk about the best sounds to use. So in general, the types of sounds that you hear in these beats are usually like bells, pianos, and usually some sort of synth or brass lead. One thing that's unique about these beats though is you tend to not hear a lot of pad or art presets. It's much more about playing keys with a synth lead or having like a bell drawn art pattern that plays throughout the entire beat. So yeah, just keep that in mind. So let's talk about the best sounds, VSTs, and presets. So the best VST by far for all Lil Uzi type beats is Electra X. It's really good because all the presets in here contain a lot of like layered sounds. Every preset is synthetic, and there's a bunch of like pre-built effects like reverb, delays, and LFOs in every preset. I'd specifically say it's really good for like any form of lead sound, whether it's like a bell, lead, or key sound. The only instance where I wouldn't recommend it would be if you're looking for like dry presets. That's more of like a purity thing, which we'll talk about later. Another thing I really like though about Electra X is it's really user friendly, so you can just like modify sounds really quickly. So for example, if I like all the effects and layers of this preset, but I just wanted to change like one sound real quick. Let's say I want to change like the actual wave shape of the sound. What you can do is come to wavetable right below here, click, and you can change the waveform completely to whatever you want. So yeah, that's one thing I really like about it. The next VST is Nexus 2. Nexus is used a lot of these beats, but specifically for piano sounds because it's by far the best VST for these. Nothing else really compares to it, at least for these types of beats. It's also really good for lead bells and layered bell sounds or any sort of synthetic lead sound, but it's not the best. I'll show you other VSTs for that. One thing that's important to note, as I'll probably mention when I'm deconstructing certain beats, is that when pianos are used for these types of beats, they tend to turn the delay and reverb off for the preset, so I advise you do that in the VST. So the next VST is Omnisphere. It's really good for like synthetic bell sounds and as well as dry lead presets. Honestly, it's really good for everything, but the problem with Omnisphere, as I've said so many times in this channel, is that there's a lot of bad presets, so the challenge with using it is knowing how to like weed them out in a sense. So for example, if I'm looking for a lead synth sound for my beat, I'd go down a type and I'd scroll down until I found, quite literally it says here lead synths, and I'd browse through here. Or if I was looking for like a bell synth sound, I'd scroll up to here and I'd go down to type and I'd click bell synth. Also, if you're looking for dry analog keys, which is also something you hear a lot in these beats, browse in the trons and optical category at the bottom here. This is where you'll find a lot of good presets for these types of sounds like mellotrons and stuff like that. So the next VST is Purity. Like I said in the Pure tutorial, it's really good for like dry sounds. So for these beats, dry brass or synth leads, as well as like dry pluck sounds is what I'd recommend using it for. But apart from those three things, it's not really good for anything else, to be honest. Finally, the last VST I want to mention is Expand 2. I didn't hear it a lot in the remakes that I did, but the VST still is really good for, again, like dry bell sounds. It's also really good for both synth and brass lead sounds, similar to Purity. But yeah, that's it for VSTs. Let's talk about the drums. So for these Uzi hyperpop beats, there's only really two 808s that matter, and that's the Zay and Spins 808. Also, the tempo for the majority of these beats ranges between 130 BPM and 160 BPM. For the more eternal take synthetic beats, you would use the Zay 808, but for the more Pluto and Baby Pluto beats, you'd use the Spins 808. But also, this is super important to understand. The drum sounds that you use should come from drum kits based or created by producers who use these 808s a lot. So if I'm making a Baby Pluto x Pluto beat with a Spins 808, producers that would come to mind would be 808 Mafia guys like DY or Southside. So I would use drum sounds from their kits. And for when I'm using a Zay 808 for an Eternal Take beat, I'd go to producers like Pierre Bourne, Plug, and Polo Boy Shoddy, and I'd use their drum kits and their drum sounds. And people like to say stuff like, oh my god, nobody's being original nowadays, everyone's using the same drum sounds. It's like, everyone's using the same drum sounds because they work. Like, there's a reason that they're using like every trap beat that's ever been made. As for drum patterns, the Spins Uzi beats are nothing special from the generic Southside 808 Mafia drum patterns. It's just a bunch of painted like 1/3 step hi-hat rolls, snare rolls, 808 patterns, and snare patterns. They specifically follow that same generic trap pattern that I talked about in the last tutorial, so I highly recommend checking that out if you haven't seen it already. But yeah, however, for the Eternal Take type beats, the drum patterns do have a very unique set of hi-hat patterns, as a lot of the time they don't use like the traditional two-step. Instead, they go something more like this. The reason that you see this is that you already have a lot of bounce in these beats from the melodies, as they tend to be very sharp and really rhythmic. So to compensate for that, you want to go for a more slow bounce in your drum patterns. That's also why you tend to hear a lot of perks and like open hats in these types of beats, and that's also why you don't hear a lot of like kicks and hard hitting snares either. But yeah, that's honestly all you need to know for drum patterns. It's nothing unique from what you already hear in most trap beats. I'm also going to go over it in the deconstructions a little bit more. So let's talk about making a melody. So for the majority of these Lil Uzi beats, they're usually sitting in the ranges of like F sharp to A flat minor scales. As like I said in the uptempo tutorial, artists who sing in their beats like Lil Uzi do so in higher octaves. So in other words, if you're trying to make like a beat, let's say for a polar opposite of that, like a 21 Savage, who has a really low voice and doesn't sing at all, you'd use a way lower scale range. But for Lil Uzi, as he sings, you want to use a way higher one. Also, there's a misconception that minor scales give off a more sad vibe and major scales give off a more happy vibe, but every major scale has a corresponding minor scale that's 3 octaves below it, so that wouldn't really make any sense. If you don't know what I'm talking about, for example, C major and A minor use the exact same notes. So do like F sharp major and D sharp minor and so on, so that logic wouldn't really make any sense. What I'm trying to get to is that's not really what determines the vibe. The vibe is more based off like the spacings that you use between the notes in your melody. So for a dark evil feel, you want spacings of 1 semitone. For a sad feel, you want spacings of 2 semitones. And generally for a more anthemic feel, you want sort of like greater spacings of 2 semitones. It's not specific. So if I were to describe Lil Uzi beats, I'd say they have like a really anthemic and sad vibe to them. So for that, I use a lot of wide and 2 semitone spacings between my notes. And generally, I try to avoid the 1 semitone spacings in my melodies. Also for these melodies, there's a lot of repetition and little variation. The only real variation that you hear in these beats is with like the bass note and a little bit in the main melody. So instead of me just sitting here making a beat to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you a bunch of remakes I did that emphasize on these points because it's hard to put into words. So here's how Futsal Shuffle is made. The first sound is this bell preset from Electra X. It's called Bell Pluck Penny, and this is the melody. Now this is the most important thing that I'm going to tell you in this tutorial. This melody may seem complex to the eye, but if you really break it down, it's not. So hypothetically, if I was to copy this entire part of the first melody and layer it over the second part, as you can see, it's still using all the same notes, but it just adds a few at the end, which is something that you'll see a lot is done in this beats. But apart from that, the melody is practically identical. Also, if you look at points like, for example, down here, you can see that like this bass note repeats itself every bar in the song. What I'm trying to say is don't make your beats like one note at a time. You should instead do it in groups. What I mean by that is you should highlight certain sections. Let's say you make like the first half of the melody and you just want to hold shift and click while highlighting it and just drag it over, and then you just want to add a few notes so it still stays the same but it doesn't get like super repetitive and boring. Also, on another note, no pun intended, you'll see that the spacings between all of the notes are like all 2 steps or like more, and there's little to few tension like we were talking about. But yeah, this part of the melody sounds like this. So the next sound is his hard lead synth that actually comes out of a VST I didn't talk about called Silent One. The preset is called LD Follow. Same thing goes for this melody. It may look complex, but the second part of the beat is literally the same melody with just the first 3 notes being moved down. It also has this gross beat gate preset that I remade. This is a really cool effect that you hear in a lot of the leads of these beats. You kind of just want to draw it in as you wish. It's not like there's any sort of rule to it. So without the gross beat effect, it sounds like this. But with the gross beat, it sounds like this. As for the drums, it's super simple. It's just an open hat and a perk that acts as a snare, a Lex Luger clap, a Zay 808, and a hi-hat pattern that is about as basic and empty as it can be. Again, this is because the gated synth lead in the beat has a crazy amount of rhythm to it, so it's serving the same purpose that a normal 2-step hi-hat pattern would. So the drums together sound like this. And the entire beat with everything together sounds like this. So here's how how do you say this?
Sanguine.
Here's how Sanguine Paradise was made. The first preset is this default piano in Nexus 2 with the reverb and delay turned off like I was talking about. It's also layered on top of this synthetic brass preset called BR Soft Brass 1. These together with the melody sounds like this. Then there's this counter melody, which is literally the default synth that you get from when you open Nexus, with just a little filter on the high end. As you can see, it's the same idea with the last beat. It's literally the exact same melody, but just a few notes are being moved down to turn it almost into a chord. That sounds like this. So the last but by far the most important thing about this beat is the root note piano melody that plays under the beat. It comes from this default FL Keys preset. Same thing as we were talking about. It's a super simple melody, but it's made significantly more interesting by just adding this little bit of variation in the root note. So to show you, the melody without the bass line sounds like this. But with the bass line, it sounds like this. So here's how Venetia was made. The first sound is this organ that comes from that same Trons and Optical library in Omnisphere. It's called Old Creaker organ. The melody once again looks complex, but it's actually really repetitive. It's just a basic chord progression with the similar two-step semitone root note pattern that I was talking about, and has this very rhythmic lead that plays on top with only a few notes being shifted and added in the second part. That sounds like this. And the only other melodic part is this plucked bell sound that comes in on the chorus. As I said in the Metro tutorial, since we're bringing in a new sound that comes out in the beat, it can't have too much rhythm or variation because it's just going to throw the artist off when it comes in and out. That's why this melody follows along with the chord progression exactly, and all the repetitive parts of the lead, with the only variation being like one note that's added in the beginning. And as for the drum pattern, it's the same idea as the futsal shovel. There's not a lot of variation or bounce to it because the lead is really rhythmic in this beat. So the drum pattern sounds like this. And everything together in the beat sounds like this. So here's how Over Your Head was made. The first sound is this synth bell preset from Omnisphere that comes from that same library we were talking about called Classic Vibrato Pluck, and it's layered on top of this other synth bell from the same library called Essence of Pluck, and they're both layered on top of this Nexus preset called P Hell Waterhouse. This is the melody, same idea as there's a lot of repetition, but you'll notice there's not a lot of rhythm to it, and there's no real key presets or lead sounds being played in the beat, so no surprise that's more of a Spins Baby Pluto X Pluto type beat. And once again, you can see that there's similarly spaced root notes that are playing throughout the melody that makes this beat way more interesting and emotional, rather than just the repetitive and boring melody that plays throughout the beat. That sounds like this. As for the drums, there isn't a whole lot of drum sounds being used. It's only a hi-hat, snare, clap, and 808. I didn't bother painting in the hi-hat pattern because it's not repetitive whatsoever, and it's really just a bunch of random third step rolls that are painted in at certain points. So there's not much to take away from it. The only thing I would say is just paint them in as you'd like. It's all about feel. Whatever feels right to you is what you should do. Also because it just sounds like your typical Southside hi-hat pattern. So everything together sounds like this. Alright, but that's going to be it for melodies as well as this tutorial. Let me know what you thought. Again, make sure to follow my Instagram and Twitter at FinnaFinesse. Go cop my drum kit. There's a link to the store in the description. But I'm also giving it away on my Instagram, so that's another reason to follow it. Sorry about the late upload, by the way. I had an exam. There wasn't much I could do about it, but that's going to be over soon in less than a week. Speaking of which, I'm going to start streaming. So I have an email link in the description of this video where you can send in beats because I'm going to be doing a beat critique live. But yeah, point is, I'm done university in like less than a week. So expect a lot more live streams and content real shortly. But yeah, apart from that, make sure to like, subscribe, and peace.